In the spring of 1944, high in the mist-shrouded hills of Nagaland, on the border between India and Burma, something inexplicable occurred. Something that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. British and Indian soldiers dug into muddy trenches on a place called Garrison Hill, reported hearing voices in the darkness. Not the taunts of Japanese propaganda broadcasts, not the screams of the wounded or dying, but something far more unsettling. Whispers, calls, the sound of their own names spoken by familiar voices. Voices that belonged to men already dead. From April to June of that year, the small hill station of Kohima became the site of one of the Second World War's most savage battles. The Japanese 31st Division, 15,000 strong, crashed against a ragtag garrison of just 1,500 defenders in a desperate bid to break into India. For 64 days, men fought and died over a piece of ground no larger than a football field. They battled across the terraced gardens of the deputy commissioner's bungalow, threw grenades at each other across a tennis court, and clawed for survival in the mud and blood of what historians would later call the Stalingrad of the East. But this is not a story about strategy or tactics. This is about what happened in the spaces between the gunfire, in the fog-choked nights when exhausted men stood watch, in the moments when the boundary between life and death grew thin as smoke. Veterans from both sides spoke of it, though many only in whispers, only to those who had been there. They described seeing figures moving through no man's land, figures that cast no shadows and made no sound. They told of hearing entire phantom units marching past their positions in the dead of night, boots crunching on gravel that shouldn't have been there. They swore they heard their mothers calling to them from across the ridge, their brothers, their friends who had fallen just hours before. The local Naga tribesmen, pressed into service as scouts and porters, had their own explanation. They said the ridge was a place where the veil between worlds had always been thin, a crossing point. And now, with so much violence, so much death soaked into the earth, that veil had been torn completely away. Were these the hallucinations of exhausted, traumatized men pushed beyond the breaking point of human endurance, the psychological fractures of combat stress manifesting as shared delusions, or did something else walk those blood-soaked hills, something older than the war? Something that fed on the suffering and called out to the dying in the voices of those they loved. Tonight, we descend into the hell of Kohima. We'll walk the same trenches where men heard impossible things. We'll examine the testimony of soldiers who swore they saw the dead still fighting. And we'll ask the question that has never been fully answered: what really happened on those hills? Because even now, more than 80 years later, visitors to the Kohima War Cemetery report feeling watched, hearing whispers on the wind, sensing a presence that refuses to rest. The battle may have ended in June of 1944, but the voices over the ridge have never stopped calling. To understand what happened at Kohima, you must first understand the desperation that brought these men to this remote corner of the world. In March of 1944, Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi launched Operation Yugo, the Japanese Empire's audacious gambit to invade India. 85,000 troops crossed the Chindwin River, driving toward the British supply bases at Imphal and Kohima. If they succeeded, they would cut off Allied forces in Burma, disrupt supply lines to China, and potentially trigger an uprising against British rule across the subcontinent. It was an all-or-nothing offensive. The March on Delhi, they called it a final throw of the dice. Kohima stood directly in their path. This sleepy hill station, perched at 7,500 feet in the Naga Hills, was little more than an administrative outpost. Its importance lay not in what it was, but in what it controlled, the only road linking the besieged garrison at Imphal to the railhead at Dimapur. Take Kohima. and Imphal would be strangled. The entire Allied position in northeast India would collapse. The Japanese 31st Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, moved with terrifying speed. They were jungle fighters, veterans of Malaya and Singapore, and they covered ground that British planners had deemed impassable. By early April, they had surrounded Kohima completely. The terrain itself was a nightmare. Garrison Hill rose like a fist from the jungle. Its slopes so steep that men had to haul themselves up by clinging to roots and vines. The deputy commissioner's bungalow sat partway up this ridge, its terraced gardens and tennis court occupying the only flat ground for miles. These gardens, these carefully manicured British touches of civilization, would become the epicenter of something approaching hell. The defenders numbered just 1,500 souls. The corps was C Company of the Royal West Kent Regiment, reinforced by whatever units could be scraped together: Assam Rifles, Nepalese troops. Rear echelon supply clerks handed rifles they barely knew how to use. They were led by Colonel Hugh Richards, a staff officer who suddenly found himself commanding what would become one of the war's most desperate last stands. When the Japanese attacked on April 5th, the fighting took on a character unlike anything else in the Burma campaign. The distances were impossibly short. Men threw grenades at enemies they could hear breathing just yards away. The tennis court became a no-man's land, with opposing forces dug in on either side, close enough to hear each other's whispered conversations in the night. A grenade thrown from the Japanese positions had 14 seconds of flight time before it landed in British trenches. 14 seconds to find cover, 14 seconds between life and death. The conditions rapidly deteriorated into something medieval. Monsoon rains began in early May, turning the battlefield into a quagmire of red mud that sucked at boots and threatened to drown wounded men who couldn't pull themselves out. The heat during the day was suffocating. At night, temperatures plummeted, leaving men shivering in sodden uniforms that never dried. Fungal infections ate through skin. Dysentery ravaged both sides. Malaria burned through the ranks. But worse than the disease, worse than the mud and the rain, was the presence of the dead. Bodies lay everywhere, in impossible positions, in advanced states of decay. The space between the lines was too narrow, too exposed for burial parties. Japanese and British corpses rotted side by side in the sun, crawling with maggots and flies. The stench was so overwhelming that reinforcements arriving in mid-April physically collapsed, vomiting uncontrollably at their first exposure to it. Veteran soldiers wrapped cloth soaked in kerosene around their faces. But nothing could keep out that smell. It seeped into everything. Into clothes, into food, into dreams. Men lived in this charnel house for weeks on end. They ate within sight of corpses. They slept next to them. In some positions, soldiers used the bodies of the fallen to reinforce their parapets, stacking them like sandbags because there was no other material available. The dead became part of the landscape, part of the architecture of survival. The psychological toll was immense. Japanese loudspeakers blared propaganda day and night, calling for surrender, describing in detail what would happen to the defenders when their position finally fell. Artillery barrages came at dawn and dusk with metronomic regularity, shredding nerves as much as flesh. Men went days without sleep, sustained only by benzodrine tablets and the animal instinct to stay alive. Their eyes took on a 1,000-yard stare. Their hands developed a perpetual tremor that wouldn't stop even when the guns fell silent. By mid-April, as the siege entered its second week, the garrison had been compressed into a pocket barely 350 yards across. Garrison Hill was all that remained. Every man knew that one more concentrated Japanese assault would finish them. They were out of ammunition, out of medical supplies, out of hope. They waited for death in trenches, ankle-deep in blood and rainwater, surrounded by their rotting dead, listening to the enemy mass in the darkness for the final attack that would surely come. It was in this crucible, in this place where the normal rules of existence had ceased to apply, that the voices began. The first reports came on the night of April 7th, just 2 days into the siege. Lance Corporal William Bentley of the Royal West Kent Regiment was on watch near the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow when he heard it. A voice calling through the darkness. His name, spoken in the thick Lancashire accent of his hometown. A voice as familiar to him as his own mother's. Willie. Willie. Lad. Come help me. Bentley froze. The voice came from no man's land, from the space between the British trenches and the Japanese positions, a space littered with corpses and wreathed in the permanent fog that clung to the ridge after sunset. He gripped his rifle tighter, convinced it was a trick. Some Japanese infiltrator who had learned English phrases to lure defenders out of position, but the accent was perfect. The inflection was exactly right. It sounded like David Harrison, his best mate from basic training, the man who had been shot through the chest 3 days earlier during a reconnaissance patrol, whose body still lay out there in the mud, unreachable, unburied. Bentley almost stood up, almost climbed out of his trench to go to his friend. Years later, he would recall that moment with a shudder, remembering how close he came to walking straight into enemy fire. Something stopped him. Some last shred of rationality that recognized the impossibility of what he was hearing. He stayed in his trench, trembling, as the voice called his name twice more before fading into the night. He told no one. Who would believe him? Who would understand? But he wasn't the only one hearing things. Lieutenant James Mackenzie, serving with the 161st Indian Brigade, reported an incident on the night of April 12th. He was conducting an inspection of the forward positions when he heard singing. Not the raucous songs soldiers sang to keep spirits up, but something older, something that raised the hairs on the back of his neck. It was in Gaelic, the ancient language of the Scottish Highlands, a warrior's lament, sung in harmony by what sounded like dozens of voices. The problem was simple. There were no Scottish units in that sector. The nearest Highland regiment was hundreds of miles away. Yet the singing continued for nearly 10 minutes, echoing across Garrison Hill with crystalline clarity, as if an entire company of men stood just beyond the tree line. When Mackenzie sent a patrol to investigate, they found nothing, just mud and corpses and the eternal fog. In his memoir, published in 1967, Mackenzie would write that it wasn't propaganda. It wasn't a trick. It was mourning, like the pipes playing for the dead at a military funeral. A sound so filled with sorrow that it seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The phenomenon spread. By mid-April, dozens of soldiers on both sides were reporting similar experiences, though few spoke openly about them for fear of being labeled shell-shocked or cowardly. But the reports were there, buried in unit diaries and personal letters that wouldn't surface until decades after the war. The Japanese were experiencing it too. A diary recovered from the body of Private First Class Tanaka Yoshio described what he called the voices of demons that plagued his unit during moonless nights. He wrote of whispers in Japanese, emerging from the darkness, calling soldiers by name and begging them to leave this cursed ground. Several men in his platoon became convinced they had angered the local spirits, the kami of this foreign land, and that they were being punished for their intrusion. Then there were the figures, shadow shapes that moved through no man's land with impossible fluidity, never quite solid enough to shoot at, never quite translucent enough to dismiss as tricks of the fog. British sentries reported seeing them dozens of times. They moved upright, walking with purpose, passing within yards of both Japanese and British positions without drawing fire from either side. When flares went up, the figures vanished, only to reappear minutes later when darkness returned. Private Arthur Cole, a 22-year-old from Manchester, swore he watched one of these shadows pause directly in front of his position, turn to look at him, and then dissolve like smoke. He described it as taller than any man he'd ever seen, with a presence that felt ancient and profoundly sad. He couldn't see its face, wasn't sure it had a face, but he felt it looking at him, felt it seeing straight through to his soul, before it continued on its way into the night. The Naga Scouts, local tribesmen who served as guides and porters for the British forces, had their own interpretation. They refused to enter certain areas after dark, particularly the stretch of ground between Garrison Hill and the abandoned village. When pressed by British officers, they spoke of Terhoma, spirits of the dead, and explained that the ridge had always been a place where the veil between worlds was thin. The massive bloodshed, they insisted, had torn that veil completely, allowing things to pass through that should remain separated from the living. But perhaps the most unnerving reports involved the voices themselves. Not just random sounds in the darkness, but specific, targeted communications. Men heard their mothers calling to them, their wives, their children. The voices spoke in their native dialect, used pet names that only family members knew, and conveyed messages of such intimate familiarity that the soldiers who heard them were reduced to tears. Lance Corporal Singh of the Indian Forces reported hearing his daughter singing a lullaby his wife used to sing to her at bedtime. His daughter was 6 years old and lived in Punjab, thousands of miles away. There was no possible way her voice could be carried to this ridge. Yet he heard it clearly, sweetly, impossibly, rising through the monsoon rain like a blessing and a curse combined. As the siege ground into its third week, the psychological strain began to show in ways that went beyond normal combat fatigue. Men developed obsessive behaviors, convinced that if they didn't perform certain rituals, the voices would come for them. Some refused to sleep, terrified of what they might hear in their dreams. Others became withdrawn, spending hours staring into the fog as if waiting for someone to emerge from it. The night of April 17th proved to be the crucible. The Japanese launched their most ferocious assault yet, determined to break through and finish the garrison once and for all. The fighting raged from dusk until dawn, a confused melee of explosions, screaming, and the wet sounds of bayonets finding flesh. The deputy commissioner's bungalow changed hands twice. Kuki Piquet fell to the Japanese. The garrison was cut in two, with isolated pockets of defenders holding out in basements and bunkers, surrounded on all sides. It was during this chaos, this darkest moment when survival seemed impossible, that the phenomenon reached its peak. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, a fog descended over the battlefield, not the normal fog that rolled down from the hills, but something denser, thicker, almost luminous in the darkness. It moved against the wind, pooling in hollows and rising in columns, as if possessed of its own intelligence. Within this fog, lights appeared, small, flickering illuminations like lanterns carried by unseen hands. They moved through the killing ground in procession, dozens of them, following paths that made no tactical sense. Japanese soldiers held their fire, transfixed. British troops stared in disbelief. The lights moved between the lines, around the shell craters, weaving among the dead with a grace that seemed choreographed. And then came the whispers, not from one direction, but from everywhere at once. A chorus of voices, speaking in every language represented on that blood-soaked hill. English, Japanese, Hindi, Nepali, and others that no one could identify. The words were indistinct, more feeling than meaning, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. Pleading, calling, trying desperately to communicate something that the living could not quite comprehend. Private Arthur Thompson, who survived the war and lived until 1995, gave an interview 3 years before his death, in which he finally spoke about what he saw that night. His voice shook as he described a full platoon of soldiers emerging from the fog, marching in perfect formation toward the Japanese lines. But their uniforms were wrong. They wore the equipment of the Great War, the previous conflict that had ended more than 25 years earlier. Their faces, he said, were hollow, empty, as if they had been marching for an eternity and no longer remembered why, but couldn't stop. He watched them pass within 10 feet of his position. He could hear the creak of their leather gear, the rhythmic fall of their boots on ground that should have been too muddy to march across. And then, as they reached the tree line, they simply faded, dissolved back into the fog, as if they had never existed at all. Thompson was not alone in seeing them. At least a dozen other soldiers reported the same phenomenon from different positions around the ridge. A phantom army, caught in a loop of eternal warfare, passing through a battlefield that had become saturated with death. Dawn broke on April 18th, with the garrison preparing for what they believed would be their final hours. The Japanese had captured most of the deputy commissioner's bungalow. Garrison Hill was all that remained. A pocket of resistance barely 350 yards across. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The wounded outnumbered those still able to fight. Colonel Richards knew that one more coordinated assault would finish them. But something happened that morning that no one could adequately explain. As the relief force from the 2nd Division finally broke through Japanese lines and began their advance toward Kohima, soldiers from both the garrison and the approaching troops reported seeing something in the pre-dawn mist. A massive formation moving down from the northern ridges. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of figures, advancing in perfect silence toward the battlefield. There was no sound of engines, no rumble of tanks or trucks, no shouted orders or marching cadence, just movement through the fog. Steady and inexorable, like a river of shadows flowing downhill. Japanese observers saw it too. Some units began repositioning, convinced they were about to be flanked by a force far larger than intelligence had suggested. But as the artillery barrage from the relief force began, as shells started screaming overhead and impacting Japanese positions, the phantom army simply vanished. One moment visible in the mist, the next moment gone, as if it had never existed. The relief of Kohima garrison at dawn became one of the war's most dramatic moments. Tanks of the Royal Berkshire Regiment crashed through Japanese positions just as the defenders were gathering for their last stand. The timing was miraculous. The margin of survival measured in minutes. But those who were there, both the relieved and the relievers, would later speak in hushed tones about what they had witnessed in the fog, about the army that wasn't there, about the presence they all felt watching as dawn broke over the blood-soaked ridge. The relief of the garrison didn't end the battle, it merely transformed it. For the next 4 weeks, British and Indian forces fought to drive the Japanese from the hills surrounding Kohima, and it was during this phase that some of the most disturbing incidents occurred. When British troops secured the bunker complex beneath the deputy commissioner's bungalow, they discovered something that defied easy explanation. One chamber, deep underground, showed signs of frantic activity. The walls were covered in scratch marks, gouged deep into the earth as if someone had tried to claw their way out. But there were no bodies, no equipment, no indication of who had been there or what had happened to them. Sergeant Robert Mills was among the first to enter that bunker. Even 50 years later, in interviews conducted in the 1990 seconds, He could not speak of it without visible distress. The smell, he said, wasn't the smell of death. It was older than that. Colder. Something that made his skin crawl and his breath come short. And on the wall, scratched deep enough to draw blood from whoever wrote it, was a phrase repeated in 3 different handwriting styles. They won't stop calling. 3 different soldiers had written the same desperate message before disappearing completely. The fighting continued through May as monsoon rains turned the battlefield into a swamp. Men fought knee-deep in mud, hauling themselves from position to position, fighting for every yard of ground. The conditions pushed human endurance past its breaking point. Soldiers began reporting experiences that went beyond traditional combat stress. Multiple men claimed to see dead members of their units still fighting alongside them, not as hallucinations or fleeting glimpses, but as solid, physical presences that moved and acted with purpose. A lance corporal would give an order to a private he'd watched die 2 days earlier, only to realize mid-sentence that he was talking to empty air. Entire squads reported hearing their former commander issuing orders from positions he'd been killed defending a week prior. These weren't isolated incidents attributable to individual trauma. They were shared experiences, corroborated by multiple witnesses, documented in unit diaries that their authors had no reason to falsify. Something was happening on that ridge that couldn't be explained by exhaustion or stress alone. On GPT Ridge, British forces captured a Japanese trench system in early May, only to abandon it 3 days later. The official reason given was tactical repositioning, but soldiers who had occupied those trenches told a different story. Every night, they heard singing, Japanese military song, rising from deep beneath the earth, as if an entire unit was buried down there, still performing their duties in death as they had in life. Patrols sent to investigate found nothing. The singing would stop the moment anyone entered the trenches, only to resume hours later when the men tried to sleep. After 3 nights, the entire unit requested transfer to a different position. Their officers, themselves unnerved by what they'd experienced, granted the request without question. Then there was the phenomenon that soldiers began calling the Kohima Echo. After particularly intense artillery barrages, when the guns fell silent and the smoke began to clear, those who listened carefully reported hearing something impossible, an echo that lasted far too long, that resonated with frequencies no explosion should produce. Within that echo, some swore they could hear screaming, not the screams of the present battle, but something older, layered beneath it. The screams of hundreds, perhaps thousands of voices, crying out in languages both familiar and unknown. The Naga guides had an explanation. They said the earth itself was screaming, that the violence of the present war had awakened memories of older conflicts. Tribal wars fought on these same hills centuries ago. Blood had been spilled here for generations, they explained. And all of it was remembered. All of it was still happening, in some realm that overlapped with but remained separate from the physical world. The current battle had simply torn the barrier between these realities, allowing past and present to bleed together. By late May, even the Japanese forces were reporting widespread psychological casualties, soldiers refusing to occupy certain positions. Entire squads found catatonic in their trenches, unresponsive to commands, staring at nothing with expressions of absolute terror. Japanese medical officers attributed it to starvation and exhaustion, but the speed and uniformity of the breakdowns suggested something more. The battleground but it was no longer just a fight between armies. It had become something else entirely, a struggle taking place on multiple levels, in multiple realities, with forces that neither side fully understood or could effectively combat. The ridge had become a place where the normal rules didn't apply, where the dead walked, where time itself seemed to fracture and loop, where every soldier, regardless of nationality, felt the presence of something vast and ancient and deeply wrong, watching from just beyond the edge of perception. So, what really happened on those hills? In the decades since the battle ended, researchers, historians, and psychologists have proposed numerous explanations for the voices over the ridge. Some are grounded in science. Others venture into territory that science has yet to adequately map. None can fully account for everything that was reported. The most conventional explanation centers on combat stress reaction, what was called battle fatigue during World War II and shell shock in the previous war. The conditions at Kohima were uniquely designed to break the human mind. Soldiers went 60 to 240 days under constant threat, with minimal sleep, inadequate food, and the perpetual presence of death in its most visceral form. Medical research has shown that such extreme conditions can produce hallucinations, both visual and auditory, that seem completely real to those experiencing them. The symptoms align disturbingly well with what was reported. Hearing voices of the dead is a documented phenomenon in severe PTSD cases. Seeing figures that aren't there, experiencing a sense of presence, feeling disconnected from reality. These are all recognized responses to extreme trauma. Nearly 1.4 million American soldiers were treated for combat fatigue during World War II. 40% of all military discharges were attributed to psychological causes. The numbers make it clear that what happened at Kohima was far from unique. But here's where the conventional explanation begins to strain. Combat stress typically produces individual hallucinations. Each person's trauma manifests in personal ways, shaped by their own fears and memories. Yet, at Kohima, multiple soldiers reported identical experiences. The Phantom Army in Great War uniforms was seen by at least a dozen men from different positions, none of whom had communicated with each other during the incident. The singing in Gaelic was heard by an entire platoon simultaneously. The lights in the fog were witnessed by both British and Japanese forces at the same time. Shared hallucinations are extraordinarily rare. They require a level of psychological synchronization that simply doesn't occur in normal circumstances. Some researchers have suggested that the extreme stress created a form of collective hysteria, where expectation and suggestion caused multiple people to experience similar delusion. But this theory struggles to explain how British soldiers and Japanese soldiers, separated by language and culture, reported such strikingly similar phenomena. Then there's the question of sensory deprivation and environmental factors. The fog that perpetually shrouded Kohima, the darkness of the jungle nights, the constant rain that created a wall of white noise. All of these could theoretically cause the brain to manufacture stimuli to fill the sensory void. Pareidolia, the tendency to find familiar patterns in random stimuli, might explain why soldiers heard voices in the wind or saw figures in the mist. More intriguing is the possibility of infrasound. Low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of human hearing have been shown to produce feelings of unease, anxiety, and even visual hallucinations. The constant artillery bombardment at Kohima would have generated massive amounts of infrasound. Research conducted in the early 2000s demonstrated that infrasound can create a sensation of presence, the feeling that something is watching you from just outside your field of vision. It can induce fear responses for no apparent reason. It can make people see things that aren't there. But again, infrasound doesn't explain the specificity of what was experienced. Why would it make men hear their own names? Why would it create coherent images of military formations rather than random shapes? Why would the phenomenon intensify in certain locations and remain consistent over weeks, rather than fluctuating randomly? Some military historians have suggested more mundane explanations. Japanese psychological warfare was sophisticated, utilizing recorded messages and trained infiltrators to demoralize enemy forces. Could the voices have been enemy soldiers, calling out in English to lure defenders out of position? Perhaps. But this theory collapses when we consider that Japanese forces reported hearing the same phenomena, unless both sides were simultaneously running identical psychological operations against each other, which seems unlikely given their desperate circumstances. Now we venture into more controversial territory. The Naga people who inhabited these hills for centuries before the war arrived had their own framework for understanding what the soldiers experienced. Their traditional animistic beliefs held that spirits inhabited every aspect of the natural world. Rivers had spirit, mountains had spirits, and the dead, especially those who died violently, became powerful spirits themselves. The Naga warned that Garrison Hill was a crossing point, a place where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of spirits had always been thin. In their cosmology, represented by the concept of terhoma, violent death in such places doesn't just end a life, it tears the fabric that separates reality, allowing things to pass through that normally couldn't. The massive scale of death at Kohima, by this understanding, didn't just kill men, it fundamentally damaged the nature of that location itself. From a Western perspective, this sounds like superstition, but anthropologists studying cultures around the world have noted that nearly every society has concepts of places where the veil between worlds grows thin. Sacred groves, burial ground, battlefields. Places where death has occurred repeatedly seem to acquire a quality that transcends simple memory. Whether this represents something objectively real or a deeply ingrained psychological response to certain environmental cues remains hotly debated. The stone tape theory, proposed by paranormal researchers in the 1970s, suggests that traumatic events can somehow be recorded in the environment, particularly in stone and crystal-rich geological formations. The Naga Hills are geologically active, part of the greater Himalayan system, with complex mineral compositions. Could extreme emotional and physical energy be stored in the rocks themselves, then played back under the right conditions? It's a theory that sits uncomfortably between science and speculation, with no solid evidence to support it, but also no definitive way to disprove it. Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious offers another framework. Jung proposed that beneath our individual consciousness lies a deeper layer of psychological material shared by all humanity. Archetypes, universal symbols and experiences, reside in this collective realm. Under extreme stress, Jung suggested, individuals might access this deeper consciousness and experience things that transcend personal memory or knowledge. Could the soldiers at Kohima have tapped into something like this, a shared pool of human experience related to war, death, and sacrifice that manifested as actual sensory experiences? More recently, researchers studying haunted locations have found correlations with unusual electromagnetic fields and geological factors. Many supposedly haunted places sit on fault lines or areas with high concentrations of certain minerals. The hypothesis is that these environmental factors might affect brain function in ways that produce hallucinations with common characteristics. Kohima's geology and the massive amount of metal and explosives concentrated there could theoretically create such conditions. But perhaps the most unsettling theory is the simplest, that consciousness itself is not fully understood, that death is not the absolute ending we assume it to be, and that in places where the boundary is tested to its limits, where thousands die in confined spaces over short periods, something genuinely anomalous can occur. Not ghosts in the traditional sense, but some form of residual consciousness, some echo of lived experience that persists in ways we lack the scientific framework to measure or comprehend. Dr. Kanado Chofi, a Naga scholar who has extensively studied his people's spiritual traditions, offers a perspective that bridges indigenous wisdom and modern thought. He suggests that the Western insistence on separating the physical from the spiritual, on treating consciousness as purely a product of brain function, may itself be a limitation. For the Naga, he explains, the spirit world and physical world were never separate. They coexist, interpenetrate, influence each other constantly. War, with its concentrated violence and trauma, doesn't create supernatural phenomena so much as it reveals what was always there, hidden beneath the surface of normal perception. What the soldiers experienced at Kohima may have been real in ways that defy our current scientific categories. Not hallucinations, not purely physical phenomena, but something that exists in the intersection between mind and matter, between the living and the dead, between what we know and what we have yet to understand. The Battle of Kohima officially ended on June 22nd, when British and Indian forces advancing from the north linked up with troops pushing out from Imphal. The Japanese 31st Division was shattered. Of the 15,000 men who entered India that spring, only 6,000 remained fit for duty. The rest were dead, wounded, or broken by disease and starvation. On the Allied side, over 4,000 casualties. The ridge had consumed them all with an appetite that seemed insatiable. But the voices didn't stop. In 1954, 10 years after the guns fell silent, Major Gordon Graham returned to Kohima. He walked the old battlefield, now overgrown with young trees and sprouting shrubs. He visited the war cemetery that had been built on Garrison Hill, where 1,421 graves stood in precise rows. He wrote about the orderly, impersonal geometry of death, about how the heartbreak was still there, inscribed on bronze plaques with the final messages from those who loved the fallen. What he didn't write about, what he told only his closest friends, was what he felt standing there at dusk. The sensation of being watched, the sound of footsteps on gravel paths where no one walked, the whispers that rose with the evening mist, just at the edge of hearing, never quite distinct enough to understand, but always there. He wasn't alone in experiencing this. Over the decades, veterans who returned to Kohima reported similar sensations, a presence that wouldn't leave, an atmosphere of unresolved tension, as if the battle was still being fought on some level invisible to normal perception. Most didn't speak about it publicly. The words sounded too strange, too disconnected from the rational world they'd returned to. But in private, among those who had been there, they acknowledged what they felt. Today, the Kohima War Cemetery is maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. It's a place of profound beauty and sorrow, with the famous epitaph carved in stone. When you go home, tell them of us and say, "For your tomorrow, we gave our today." Tourists come from around the world to pay respects, to remember, to honor the sacrifice. And some of them report experiences they struggle to explain. A sudden coldness in certain sections of the cemetery, even on hot days. The feeling of someone standing just behind them, vanishing when they turn. Voices carried on the wind, speaking in languages they don't understand. Most dismiss it as imagination, the power of suggestion, in a place so heavy with history. But others aren't so sure. Local Naga people continue to perform traditional ceremonies at certain spots on the old battlefield. They burn incense and offer prayers, not to any Christian god, but to the older spirits their ancestors honored. They say they're helping the restless souls find peace, both the souls of the soldiers who died and the soul of the land itself, wounded by so much violence. They say some places never fully heal. Some places remember. The night watchmen employed at the cemetery refuse to work alone after dark. They won't discuss why. Not with outsiders. But among themselves they speak of nights when the mist comes down and the monuments cast shadows that move wrong. Of mornings when they find footprints in the dew. Boot prints that lead to graves and then simply stop. As if whoever made them had sunk into the earth itself. Private Arthur Thompson, in that interview 3 years before his death, was asked directly, did he believe what he saw was real? His answer was, careful. Measured by decades of trying to make sense of the impossible. I've carried them with me all my life, he said. His voice barely above a whisper. The voices, sometimes, in the quiet. I still hear them. I don't know if they were real. I don't know if it matters. They were real to us. That's what counts. Real to us. Perhaps that's the only answer we can give with certainty. In that place, at that time, under those conditions, men experienced something that transcended normal reality. Whether it originated in their traumatized minds, in some quirk of geology and physics we don't yet understand, or in a genuine thinning of the boundary between life and death. The effect was the same. They heard the voices of the dead. They saw things that shouldn't exist. They felt the presence of something vast and inexplicable pressing in from all sides. War destroys more than bodies. It tears at the fabric of reality itself. It takes young men and subjects them to horrors that should not exist, then asks them to remain sane, remain human, remain themselves. Most fail in some way. The lucky ones come home. The unlucky ones don't. And some, perhaps, remain trapped in that moment forever, unable to move forward or back. Caught in a loop of eternal violence from which there is no escape. The voices over the ridge may be echoes of that trap. The cries of men who died before they were ready. In places far from home. For causes they barely understood. Or they may be something else entirely. Something we lack the wisdom or the words to properly describe. The territory between life and death. Between the physical and the spiritual. Between what we know and what we fear. Remains unmapped. Kohima sits in that territory. A landmark in a realm we pretend doesn't exist. So what is the truth? Were the voices real? Or were they the desperate inventions of minds pushed past their breaking point? Did something genuinely supernatural occur on those hills? Or was it all biology and psychology dressed up in the language of mystery? Maybe the question itself is flawed. Maybe real and unreal aren't the binary opposites we assume them to be. Maybe there are experiences that exist in the space between, that are true without being factual, that haunt us precisely because they resist easy categorization. What we know for certain is this. Thousands of men fought and died on a ridge in northeast India in the spring of 1944. Many of those men, before they died, or in the years after, reported experiences that defied rational explanation. Those experiences were real to them. The fear was real. The voices were real. And whether those voices came from outside or inside, whether they were ghosts or memories or something else entirely, they left marks that time has not erased. If you ever find yourself at Kohima War Cemetery at dusk, when the mist rolls down from the hills and the shadows grow long between the graves, stand very still. Listen, not with your ears, but with that deeper sense that knows when you're not alone. You might hear it, that whisper on the wind, that echo of something that refuses to be forgotten. The voices calling from the ridge, still searching for the peace they were denied in life. Still fighting battles that will never end. Still hoping. Perhaps that someone will finally hear them and understand. The dead of Kohima gave their today for our tomorrow. But some of them, it seems, are still waiting for that tomorrow to arrive. Still standing watch on a ridge 8,000 feet above the sea, surrounded by fog and memory, calling out names that no one answers anymore. And maybe, just maybe, they always will be.